Tyler Johnson was just 12 years old, but already he bore the weight of responsibilities far beyond his years. His mother, Maria, worked two jobs, cleaning offices by day and serving tables at a local diner by night, while his father, David, had been out of work for nearly a year due to a serious back injury sustained in a warehouse accident. The Johnsons lived in a small apartment on the outskirts of the city, the kind of place where rent always seemed to go up, but the conditions never improved. Tyler's clothes were worn, his sneakers held together by threads, and his school supplies were often secondhand, donated by local charities. But despite their financial struggles, the Johnsons were a proud family, bonded by love and determination. Tyler knew that every dollar mattered. He'd often overhear his mother late at night, trying to figure out how to stretch what little money they had to cover the bills. The fridge was always sparse, and Tyler couldn't help but notice the growing pile of envelopes marked "Final Notice" on the kitchen counter. It was in the face of these challenges that Tyler had decided to take matters into his own hands. He started buying small packs of candy from a discount store with the little pocket money he managed to save or scrape together. After school, he would head downtown and sell the candy to passers-by, hoping to earn a few extra dollars to help lighten the load at home. He wasn't oblivious to the fact that selling candy on the streets without a permit was illegal. He'd heard the warnings and seen other street vendors being hassled by the police before. But to Tyler, it felt like a minor risk compared to the reward. His heart swelled with pride every time he handed his mother a few crumpled bills at the end of the day, watching her eyes fill with gratitude and relief. "You shouldn't be doing this, Tyler," she'd often say, shaking her head, but her voice would crack with emotion. She knew he was trying to help, and in a way, she was torn. Proud of his determination, but fearful of the consequences. Every day, Tyler would leave school and take the bus downtown. He had a favorite spot near a busy intersection where office workers passed by during lunch breaks, and tourists roamed the streets, often looking for small snacks. He learned to read people quickly, who would stop, who would smile politely but walk on, and who might just give him a few extra dollars out of kindness. He wasn't pushy. He wasn't loud. He just stood there, quietly offering his candy, hoping that someone would see the earnestness in his eyes. Tyler's world was small but heavy, and every day felt like a battle. He missed the carefree life he saw other kids his age living, playing video games, hanging out at the park, not worrying about where the next meal would come from. But there was a quiet resilience in Tyler, a determination to keep pushing forward for his family. He had no illusions about how hard things were, but he also believed that if he could just make a little more money, maybe, just maybe, it would ease his mother's burden. That belief was enough to keep him going. But what Tyler didn't know was that today, his quiet routine would be disrupted in a way he never expected. A confrontation was brewing, one that would test not only his courage, but also his very understanding of justice and fairness. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the city streets, Tyler took his usual position near the busy corner, candy in hand, ready for another day of selling. But today, things were about to change. The downtown area of the city was a maze of towering buildings, bustling sidewalks, and a constant hum of activity. People hurried from one place to another, most with their eyes glued to their phones, barely noticing the world around them. It was the heart of the city's commerce, where business professionals, tourists, and street performers all shared the same crowded sidewalks. The buildings rose high, their glass facades gleaming under the sun, reflecting the busy streets below. Sidewalks were lined with food trucks and small vendors, each trying to catch the attention of the hurried masses. Tyler had chosen this spot carefully. It was a busy intersection near a subway station, where the foot traffic was almost guaranteed. Office workers, in their sharp suits and briefcases, would walk briskly by, their minds occupied with meetings and deadlines. Some would glance at him, their eyes lingering for a second before moving on, while others avoided his gaze altogether, too caught up in their own world. Tourists, on the other hand, were usually more relaxed, strolling through the streets, taking in the sights. They were the ones more likely to stop, maybe buy a piece of candy, or give him a couple of dollars with a smile. Despite the constant movement and noise, there was an underlying tension in the area. Signs posted on nearly every street corner warned against unauthorized vending. No street vendors. Violators will be fined. They were a constant reminder of the risk Tyler took every day. The city had cracked down hard on street sellers in recent years, citing safety concerns and the need to keep the sidewalks clear for pedestrians. But to Tyler and the others like him, these signs were just another obstacle in a life already full of them. He knew he wasn't supposed to be there. The rules were clear. But what choice did he have? Selling candy was the only way he could contribute to his family's dwindling finances. The police patrolled the area regularly, and Tyler had seen more than a few vendors get fined, or worse, have their goods confiscated. The officers would come by, usually giving a stern warning before moving on. Most days, Tyler managed to avoid them, slipping into the crowd when he saw them coming, or ducking into a nearby alley until they passed. But today felt different. There was a heaviness in the air, a sense of inevitability that Tyler couldn't shake. The streets were alive with noise. The honking of taxis, the distant wail of sirens, and the chatter of people going about their business. It was chaotic, but it was also familiar to Tyler. He had become part of the background, blending into the hustle and bustle of the city. Most people barely noticed him, just another kid trying to make a few dollars. But today, someone would notice. And it wouldn't be a kind stranger or a generous tourist. As Tyler set up his small box of candy on the edge of the sidewalk, his eyes constantly scanned the crowd. He knew the routine by now, watching for the subtle signs of approaching trouble. He wasn't the only one trying to make a living on these streets. A few other street vendors, older men and women selling everything from knockoff sunglasses to flowers, had their own designated spots nearby. They, too, kept a wary eye on the streets, ready to pack up and move at a moment's notice if things got too risky. Tyler's spot was in front of an old department store, long abandoned and boarded up. The windows were covered in graffiti, and the once grand entrance was now a gathering spot for the city's forgotten. Homeless people, out-of-work artists, and those who had nowhere else to go. It wasn't the most glamorous part of the city, but it was where Tyler felt safest. It was where he could disappear if he needed to. But today, Tyler didn't see the usual warning signs. No officers on the horizon, no sudden shift in the crowd's movement. Just the normal ebb and flow of city life. He relaxed, just a little, as he handed a small pack of gum to a woman passing by, thanking her for her generosity. He was starting to feel like maybe, just maybe, today would go smoothly. But then, from the corner of his eye, he saw something that made his stomach drop. A figure in uniform, moving toward him with purpose. Tyler's heart raced. He had been careful, but not careful enough. His mind raced with thoughts of what would happen next. He knew he had to keep calm, keep selling like nothing was wrong. But inside, he was terrified. As the figure got closer, Tyler recognized him immediately. Hank Peterson, the chief of police. The man was infamous among street vendors, known for his no-nonsense attitude and his disdain for those who broke the rules, no matter their circumstances. Tyler quickly turned his back, pretending not to notice. But it was too late. Hank had seen him. Hank Peterson was not a man easily ignored. His presence commanded attention the moment he stepped onto any street corner, his uniform crisp and his badge gleaming under the afternoon sun. At 6'3", with broad shoulders and a stocky build, Hank looked every bit the part of a man who had spent his career enforcing the law. His face was hardened, weathered by years on the force, with deep-set lines around his mouth that seemed permanently etched in a scowl. His eyes, a cold, steely blue, had a way of piercing through people, making them feel smaller, lesser, under his scrutiny. Hank had grown up in the city, and in many ways, he saw himself as the last bastion of order in a place that, to him, had long since fallen into chaos. The streets had changed since he was a kid. More crime, more poverty, and in his mind, more people trying to take advantage of the system. Over the years, his outlook had become increasingly cynical. To Hank, rules were black and white, and anyone who broke them, no matter how small the infraction, deserved to face the consequences. But there was something else about Hank, something that everyone on the street knew, even if they didn't say it out loud. Hank had a particular disdain for the vulnerable. He viewed the homeless, the poor, and especially the street vendors as a blight on the city, as people who were too lazy to follow the rules. His heavy-handed approach to law enforcement had earned him a reputation. Some feared him, others resented him, but most just tried to stay out of his way. As he made his way through the crowded downtown streets that day, Hank's mood was darker than usual. His week had been filled with bureaucratic headaches, endless meetings about budgets, community outreach programs that he had no interest in, and the latest city council proposal to make the streets more vendor-friendly. It was, to Hank, just another example of the city going soft. Catering to lawbreakers, he had muttered to his deputy the day before, shaking his head in disgust. He didn't care about their circumstances, their hardships. To Hank, a violation of the law was still a violation, and the city was better off without these so-called entrepreneurs cluttering the streets. Today, however, Hank was out of the office, which suited him just fine. He preferred being in the field, where he could actually see the results of his work. As he walked, his eyes scanned the sidewalks, searching for anyone who might be testing his patience. That's when he spotted Tyler. The boy stood out immediately, too young, too small, and standing right by the intersection where Hank had told his officers to keep a close watch. He felt his jaw clench as he zeroed in on the boy, moving through the crowd like a predator stalking his prey. "Here we go," Hank muttered under his breath, his eyes narrowing. Tyler didn't see him at first, which was just as well. Hank preferred it that way. It gave him time to assess the situation, to determine how best to handle it. But as he got closer, he saw the familiar sight. A box of candy in Tyler's hands, his young face focused on trying to catch the attention of passing pedestrians. Hank's blood boiled. How many times had he told people that street vending without a permit was illegal? How many warnings had gone unheeded? To Hank, this boy was no different from the others, just another lawbreaker who thought the rules didn't apply to him. By the time Tyler finally noticed Hank approaching, it was too late. The boy's eyes widened, and Hank could see the panic flash across his face. Good, Hank thought. He should be scared. "Hey," Hank barked, his voice cutting through the noise of the street like a whip. "What do you think you're doing?" Tyler froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He had seen Hank before, had heard the stories about how ruthless he could be with street vendors. But hearing about it and being on the receiving end were two very different things. Tyler's mind raced, trying to come up with something, anything, that might explain his presence without making things worse. I'm just selling some candy, sir," Tyler stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. Hank stepped closer, his towering figure casting a shadow over the boy. "You know it's illegal to sell without a permit, right? Or did you think you'd get away with it because you're a kid?" Tyler swallowed hard, his throat dry. I didn't mean any harm. I'm just trying to help my family. My dad, I don't care about your sob story," Hank interrupted, his voice harsh and dismissive. "You think the rules don't apply to you because you've got a rough situation at home? Think again, kid. Rules are rules." The coldness in Hank's voice cut through Tyler like a knife. He had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that maybe Hank would understand. That maybe he would see that Tyler wasn't just another troublemaker, that he was trying to do the right thing in the only way he knew how. But there was no compassion in Hank's eyes, only anger and disdain. "Pack it up," Hank ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. "And don't let me catch you here again, or you'll be spending the night in a cell." Tyler's hands shook as he fumbled to close his box of candy, tears welling up in his eyes. He knew he should say something, that he should stand up for himself, but the words wouldn't come. All he could do was nod silently, his heart sinking as he realized just how powerless he was in the face of someone like Hank. Hank watched him for a moment longer, his expression hard and unyielding, before turning and walking away, satisfied that he had made his point. But even as he left, something gnawed at him. Maybe it was the way the boy had looked at him, or maybe it was the fact that no matter how many vendors he chased off the streets, they always seemed to come back. Whatever it was, Hank pushed it to the back of his mind. He had done his job, and that was all that mattered. As Hank Peterson walked away, his heavy boots echoing off the concrete, Tyler's world felt like it was collapsing. The box of candy in his hands was no longer just a means to make money. It had become a symbol of his helplessness. He had tried to stand tall, to explain, to make Hank see that he wasn't just another rule breaker, but the words had died in his throat. Tyler's shoulders slumped as he slowly began to pack up, his hands trembling as he placed the remaining candy bars back into the worn cardboard box. But Hank wasn't done with him. A few steps away, the chief of police turned back, his eyes narrowing as he observed Tyler's small figure trying to disappear into the crowd. Something about the boy's defiance, his mere presence on this street, despite the city's clear rules, made Hank's blood boil even hotter. "Hey!" Hank barked again, his voice sharp like a whip. Tyler flinched, turning back reluctantly to face the imposing figure of the officer. Hank strode back toward him, his face twisted in frustration. "I told you to pack it up, kid. Or do I need to explain it slower for you to get the message?" "I am packing it up," Tyler stammered, his hands shaking as he hurried to close the flaps of the box. His heart raced, and his mind scrambled to find something, anything, that might calm the situation. "Please, sir. I just needed to help my mom. My dad. He's hurt, and we don't have enough money for rent this month. I'm not trying to cause trouble." Tyler's voice cracked as he spoke, and he could feel the tears welling up again, threatening to spill over. He hated that he was about to cry in front of Hank, hated that his fear made him feel even smaller. He had tried so hard to be brave, to do what he thought was right, but in front of Hank, he felt like nothing. But Hank wasn't moved by Tyler's plea. He had heard 100 stories just like this one, and in his eyes, they were all excuses. Excuses for why people thought they could break the law. It didn't matter to him that Tyler was just a kid, or that his family was struggling. All Hank saw was another street vendor who thought they could get away with ignoring the rules. "You think your little sob story is going to get you out of this?" Hank's voice dripped with contempt as he loomed over Tyler. "I don't care what's going on at home. You're breaking the law, and that's all that matters. You don't get a free pass because you've got a sad story, understand?" Tyler swallowed hard, his chest tightening as the officer's words cut through him. He wanted to say something back, to stand up for himself, but the fear paralyzed him. All he could do was nod, his eyes cast down at the ground. He knew it wouldn't make a difference anyway. Hank had already made up his mind about him. "You think you're the only one who's got problems?" Hank pressed on, his voice growing louder. A few passers-by slowed down, watching the scene unfold with a mixture of curiosity and discomfort, but no one stepped in. "You think you're the only one who's had it tough? Let me tell you something, kid. Life's hard for everyone. That doesn't mean you get to break the law whenever you feel like it." "I'm sorry," Tyler whispered, his voice barely audible. His chest ached from holding back tears, and his hands were clammy as they gripped the edge of his candy box. "I didn't mean to." "You didn't mean to what?" Hank cut him off, his face inches from Tyler's now. "You didn't mean to get caught? Or you didn't mean to break the law in the first place? Either way, I don't care. You're done here." Tyler's heart pounded in his chest as Hank's words hung in the air. It was like everything around him had frozen. The bustling city, the honking cars, the chatter of people walking by. All of it faded into the background as Tyler faced down the harshest authority figure he had ever encountered. And then, in the silence, Hank made his final move. "You know what?" Hank said, his voice dangerously calm now. "I think you need to learn a lesson." Before Tyler could even process what was happening, Hank grabbed his arm, his grip tight and unrelenting. Tyler's candy box fell to the ground, the contents scattering across the sidewalk as Hank began to pull him toward the edge of the street. "Wait," Tyler cried out, trying to pull back, but Hank's grip was iron. Panic surged through him, and for a brief moment, he thought about running, about bolting into the crowd and disappearing. But his feet wouldn't move. "Please, I'm sorry, I won't sell here again. I'll stop, I swear." But Hank didn't stop. His eyes were set on the police car parked just down the street, where he planned to take Tyler to the station. "You should have thought of that before," Hank muttered under his breath as he dragged Tyler along. People stared, some with pity, others with indifference, but no one stepped forward to help. Tyler's chest heaved as the reality of what was happening set in. He was being arrested for selling candy, for trying to help his family, and no one cared enough to stop it. Tears finally spilled over as Tyler looked around, desperate for someone, anyone, to intervene. But all he saw were blank faces, turned away as if they couldn't bear to witness what was unfolding. It was just another day in the city, another boy in trouble, and for a moment, Tyler wondered if this was what it meant to be truly invisible. Tyler's heart raced as Hank's grip tightened around his arm, pulling him toward the police car parked on the corner. Panic welled up inside him as he struggled to process what was happening. This couldn't be real. He was just a kid, selling candy, trying to help his family. How had it come to this? "Please," Tyler cried, his voice cracking as he tried to keep up with Hank's long strides. "Please, sir, you don't understand. I'm not trying to break the law. I swear. I'm just trying to help my mom." But Hank's face remained hard, his jaw clenched in irritation. "I told you, kid. I don't care about your excuses," he said, his tone cold and final. "You're not special. You're not above the law. So stop whining and get moving." Tyler stumbled as Hank pulled him along, his legs struggling to keep pace with the larger man. His thoughts raced, searching for something, anything, that might change Hank's mind. Maybe if he explained it better, if he made Hank understand what was really going on at home, the officer would show some compassion. Maybe he'd see that Tyler wasn't a troublemaker, that he was just a kid trying to do the right thing. "My dad," Tyler started again, his breath coming in short, desperate bursts. "He's hurt. He can't work, and my mom. She's doing everything she can, but it's not enough. We're behind on rent, and the bills are piling up. I just wanted to help. I wasn't trying to break the law, I swear." Hank stopped abruptly, spinning around to face Tyler. His eyes, cold and unforgiving, bore into the boy's tear-streaked face. For a brief second, Tyler thought he saw something flicker in the officer's eyes. Maybe a hint of understanding, maybe even sympathy. But just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone, replaced by the same stern look that Hank had worn from the beginning. "Do you think you're the only one with problems?" Hank snapped, his voice rising with frustration. "Do you think I don't hear this same story 100 times a day? Every one of you out here has an excuse. Every one of you thinks that your situation is different, that you deserve a break. Well, newsflash, kid. The world doesn't work that way. There are rules for a reason, and you don't get to ignore them just because life is tough." Tyler's chest tightened as Hank's words hit him like a punch. He wanted to scream, to fight back, to make Hank see that this wasn't just some excuse. This was his life, his family's survival. But no matter what he said, Hank wasn't going to listen. The realization washed over Tyler like a wave, cold and suffocating. He had no power here, no voice. In Hank's eyes, he was just another lawbreaker, no different from anyone else. "Please," Tyler whispered, his voice barely audible now, the fight draining out of him. "Please don't do this. I'll never sell here again. I promise." Hank shook his head, his expression unmoved. "You should have thought about that before you decided to break the law," he said flatly. "It's too late now." Tyler's mind raced, searching for some final plea that might reach Hank. His dad's face flashed in his mind. The way he winced in pain every time he tried to stand. The nights he spent lying awake, unable to sleep because of the pain in his back. And his mom, exhausted, her eyes heavy with the weight of all the worry she carried. He had to make Hank understand. He had to. "My dad, he was hurt on the job," Tyler said, his voice trembling. "It wasn't his fault. He used to work in a warehouse, but the company, they didn't care about safety, and now he can't walk right. They didn't help us. They just let him go. And now we don't have enough for rent. I thought if I could make just a little money, it would help. I'm not trying to cause trouble, sir. I'm just trying to keep us from losing our home." For the first time, Hank paused. His grip on Tyler's arm loosened slightly as he studied the boy's face. There was something in Tyler's eyes, something raw, something real, that gave Hank pause. It was the kind of desperation that couldn't be faked, the kind that came from someone who had seen too much struggle, too much hardship, for his age. For a moment, Hank felt something stir inside him, something he hadn't felt in years. It was the faintest glimmer of empathy, a reminder of why he had joined the force in the first place. But that feeling was quickly swallowed up by the hardened exterior he had built over years of dealing with the city's toughest streets. He couldn't afford to be soft. Not here. Not now. "Look," Hank said, his tone slightly softer, but still firm. I get it. Life's not fair. But that doesn't mean you get to break the rules. If I let you off the hook, what kind of message does that send? That the law doesn't matter? That you can just do whatever you want if things get tough? Tyler opened his mouth to respond, but the words stuck in his throat. He wanted to argue, to tell Hank that sometimes the rules didn't make sense, that sometimes people had no other choice. But he knew it wouldn't matter. Hank had made up his mind. I'm sorry, Tyler whispered, his eyes dropping to the ground. He wasn't just apologizing for selling candy. He was apologizing for everything, for his family's situation, for the choices he had made, for not being able to do more. He was apologizing because, in this moment, he felt like he had failed them. Hank sighed, his eyes scanning the street, as if searching for some unseen answer. He still hadn't let go of Tyler's arm, but there was something different now, a slight hesitation in his movements. For the first time, Hank didn't know what to do. The pause that hung between Hank and Tyler felt like an eternity. The busy city street, once full of life and motion, now seemed to blur into the background as the young boy stood face to face with the harsh reality of his situation. Tyler's heart sank deeper with each passing second, knowing that no amount of pleading or explanation would save him from what was coming next. Hank, still gripping Tyler's arm, wrestled with the fleeting moment of doubt that had crept into his mind. He could feel the eyes of passers-by on him now, their gazes a mixture of curiosity and silent judgment. He knew this was just another day for them. Another street vendor in trouble. Another nameless face in a city that chewed up people like Tyler and spit them out. He'd seen it 1,000 times before, and it was exactly that repetition that hardened him. Empathy had no place here. There were rules, and his job was to enforce them, not to question them. I'm taking you in, Hank said at last, his voice flat and unfeeling. His grip tightened on Tyler's arm, and he began pulling the boy toward the squad car. Tyler's breath hitched in his chest as the realization hit him like a ton of bricks. He was being arrested. Not just fined, not just scolded, arrested. For selling candy. His legs felt like jelly as Hank dragged him forward, his sneakers scraping against the pavement as he struggled to keep up. No, please, Tyler shouted, panic seizing his voice now as the weight of the situation overwhelmed him. He twisted in Hank's grasp, trying to pull free, but Hank's grip was too strong. I'm sorry. I'll never do it again, I swear. I won't sell here anymore, I promise. Hank kept walking, his expression stony, ignoring the boy's desperate pleas. The crowd around them had grown, with people now openly watching the scene unfold. Some looked away, uncomfortable with the sight of a child being taken away in handcuffs, while others murmured quietly among themselves, wondering what the boy could have possibly done to deserve such treatment. Let me go, please, Tyler cried, tears streaming down his face as he looked around, hoping, praying that someone, anyone, would intervene. But no one stepped forward. Some bystanders averted their eyes, as if pretending they didn't see what was happening would absolve them of any responsibility. Others simply shook their heads, their faces a mix of pity and resignation. As they neared the police car, Tyler's fear escalated into full-blown panic. Please, you don't have to do this, he begged, his voice hoarse from crying. Please, I'm not a criminal. Hank finally stopped, turning to face Tyler. You broke the law, kid, Hank said coldly, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. That's all there is to it. Tyler's eyes widened as he saw the gleaming metal of the handcuffs. No, please, he sobbed, pulling against Hank's grip as if his life depended on it. I'm not a bad person. I'm not trying to hurt anyone. Hank's face remained impassive as he roughly yanked Tyler's arm forward, snapping the handcuffs around his small wrists. The metal was cold against Tyler's skin, the sound of the cuffs locking into place echoing in his ears like a death knell. He had never been this close to the law before, never imagined that something like this could happen to him. Hank shoved Tyler into the back seat of the squad car, his movements quick and efficient, as though the boy was just another part of his routine. As the door slammed shut behind him, Tyler's world felt like it had shrunk to the size of that small, cramped space in the back of the car. His wrists ached from the tightness of the cuffs, and the tears that streamed down his face blurred his vision. The car door opened again, and Hank slid into the driver's seat, the weight of the moment seemingly lost on him. He started the engine, not once looking back at Tyler, whose soft sobs filled the silent space of the car. As Hank pulled away from the curb, the city continued on as if nothing had happened. People went about their day, cars honked in the distance, and the crowd that had gathered quickly dispersed, their curiosity satisfied for the moment. Inside the car, Tyler's mind raced. He couldn't believe this was happening. He wasn't a criminal. He was just trying to help. His thoughts were a whirlwind of fear and regret. What would his mom say? What would his dad think? They couldn't afford to bail him out of jail. Hell, they could barely afford to pay rent. His stomach churned at the thought of his mother's face when she found out what had happened, the disappointment in her eyes, the shame that he had failed them. The car ride felt endless, even though the police station was only a few blocks away. Tyler's tears had dried by the time they pulled into the station, but his chest still ached with the weight of everything that had just happened. As Hank led him out of the car and into the building, Tyler's feet dragged along the ground, his mind numb from the shock of it all. The inside of the police station was a blur of noise and movement. Officers talking to one another, phones ringing, people waiting to be processed. Hank led Tyler to the booking area, where another officer sat behind a desk, filling out paperwork. Tyler's hands shook as he stood there, his small frame dwarfed by the sterile, imposing walls of the station. "Got a kid selling candy without a permit," Hank said gruffly to the officer behind the desk, handing over Tyler's information. The other officer barely glanced at Tyler, his eyes focused on the paperwork in front of him. Tyler stood silently, his head hanging low, as they processed him. The humiliation was overwhelming. He had always thought of the police as people who were supposed to protect him, not people who would arrest him for trying to make a few dollars to help his family. But here he was, in handcuffs, treated like a criminal. As they led him to a holding cell, Tyler's legs felt like they might give out beneath him. He wanted to disappear, to wake up and realize that this was all just a bad dream. But it wasn't. This was real. And no amount of tears would change that. The cell door clanged shut behind him, and Tyler sank onto the small bench, his hands still cuffed in front of him. He stared down at the cold, concrete floor, his mind spinning with thoughts of his family, his future, and the cruel twist of fate that had brought him here. The hours that passed in the holding cell felt like days to Tyler. His head hung low as he sat on the cold, hard bench, his thoughts a tangled mess of fear, shame, and regret. He couldn't stop thinking about his mom, how devastated she would be when she found out. The thought of her working 2 jobs, struggling to make ends meet, only for him to end up in jail, was more than he could bear. The cell was dimly lit, and the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead only added to the eerie stillness of the place. Every now and then, the sound of footsteps or the clang of a cell door broke the silence, but for the most part, it was quiet, a quiet that felt heavy and oppressive. Tyler's hands, still cuffed, rested in his lap, the metal biting into his wrists. He hadn't cried since he was brought into the station, but the tears were there, just beneath the surface, threatening to spill over at any moment. He hadn't been given a chance to call his parents yet, though he wasn't even sure what he would say if he did. How could he explain this? How could he tell them that their son, who had only been trying to help, was sitting in a jail cell for selling candy? The thought made his stomach turn. But then, the sound of heavy footsteps approached his cell, and Tyler's heart skipped a beat. He looked up, expecting to see Hank or another officer, but instead, he saw a familiar face. His father, David Johnson. Tyler's eyes widened in disbelief. "Dad," he whispered, his voice hoarse from the hours of silence. He hadn't expected his father to come. He hadn't wanted his father to see him like this. David Johnson wasn't the imposing figure he had once been. His tall, broad-shouldered frame now stooped slightly, and the limp in his gait was more pronounced than Tyler remembered. The warehouse accident that had left David injured had changed everything for the family. Once a strong, proud man, David had been reduced to a shadow of his former self, unable to work, unable to provide, and forced to watch as his wife and son struggled to keep the family afloat. But despite the physical pain and the toll it had taken on his body, There was still a fire in David's eyes, a fierce protectiveness when it came to his son. And now, as he stood outside the cell, that protectiveness burned brighter than ever. David stepped forward, gripping the bars of the cell tightly. "Tyler," he said softly, his voice filled with a mixture of sadness and frustration. "What happened?" Tyler felt the floodgates of emotion open. The tears he had been holding back all afternoon came rushing out, and he quickly wiped them away with the back of his hand, embarrassed to be crying in front of his father. "I was just trying to help," he mumbled, his voice cracking with the weight of everything he had been holding inside. I didn't mean for this to happen." David's jaw clenched as he listened to his son. He could see the fear and shame in Tyler's eyes, and it broke his heart. He wanted to comfort his boy, to tell him that everything would be okay, but the anger he felt toward the system, the injustice of it all, made it hard to find the right words. "I know you were, son," David said, his voice low and steady. He reached through the bars and placed a hand on Tyler's shoulder, offering what little comfort he could. "I know." But even as David tried to console his son, his mind raced with anger and disbelief. He couldn't understand how things had come to this. How a 12-year-old boy, selling candy to help his family, could end up in jail. It was absurd. It was unjust. And David wasn't going to stand for it. At that moment, Hank Peterson entered the hallway, his face as impassive as ever. He had been overseeing the paperwork on Tyler's arrest and was surprised to find a man waiting outside the boy's cell, glaring at him with a fury he hadn't anticipated. "You the father?" Hank asked, crossing his arms over his chest as he approached. David's eyes flashed with anger as he turned to face the police chief. "Yeah, I'm his father," he said, his voice cold and measured. "And I want to know why my son is sitting in a jail cell for selling candy." Hank's expression remained unreadable. "Your son was selling without a permit, which is against city ordinances," he replied flatly. "I don't make the rules, but I enforce them. Your kid broke the law. It's that simple." David's nostrils flared as he stepped closer to Hank, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "That's your justification? A permit?" He's 12 years old. He wasn't out here causing trouble. He was just trying to help his family. And this is how you handle it? By locking him up like some kind of criminal? Hank held his ground, his eyes narrowing slightly as David's frustration boiled over. "Look, I understand that you're upset," Hank said, his voice firm but calm. "But the law is the law. It doesn't matter what the reason is. Your son broke it." David shook his head, disbelief etched into his features. "The law is the law," he repeated bitterly. "What kind of world are we living in where a boy gets arrested for trying to help his family survive? Where's the compassion? Where's the decency?" Hank's eyes flickered, but he remained silent. He had heard this argument before, countless times from people who felt they had been wronged by the system. But to Hank, the law was absolute. He wasn't paid to interpret it, just to enforce it. David wasn't done. "You don't know what we've been through," he continued, his voice rising with each word. "You don't know what it's like to be injured, out of work, struggling to keep your family from falling apart. My son didn't deserve this. He was doing what he thought he had to do. And now, because of you, he's going to think that no matter how hard he tries, the world's always going to be stacked against him." There was a heavy silence that followed David's words, and for the first time, Hank found himself at a loss. The fire in David's eyes was unmistakable, a father's righteous anger, fueled by years of hardship and the desire to protect his son at all costs. For the briefest of moments, Hank wondered if maybe, just maybe, he had been too harsh. David Johnson stood face to face with Hank Peterson, the tension between them thick enough to cut with a knife. Tyler watched from behind the bars of his cell, his heart pounding in his chest as he saw the raw anger in his father's eyes. David had always been a calm man, even in the face of adversity. But today, something had snapped. Seeing his son in handcuffs for selling candy was too much. Hank remained stoic, his expression unreadable, but there was an unmistakable stiffness in the way he stood, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of activity from the rest of the station, but it felt as though everything had come to a standstill. "You don't know what you've done," David said, his voice low but shaking with restrained fury. "You don't know who you're dealing with." Hank raised an eyebrow, unimpressed by David's thinly veiled threat. "Is that right?" he replied, his tone cold. "Because from where I'm standing, your kid broke the law. It's as simple as that." David's jaw clenched, and he took a step closer to Hank, his fists balled at his sides. "My son isn't a criminal," he hissed. "He's 12 years old. He was out there selling candy to help us survive because I can't work, because I've spent the last year fighting the system that abandoned me after I got hurt on the job." Hank's eyes narrowed slightly. "Look, I don't know anything about your situation," he said, his voice still firm, "but I know the law, and the law says no selling without a permit." David's face flushed with anger. "The law?" he spat. "The law that lets billion-dollar corporations get away with anything they want, while a kid trying to help his family gets thrown in a cell. That law?" Hank's expression remained stony, though his eyes flickered with something unreadable. "This isn't about corporations or big money," he said. "This is about keeping order. We have rules for a reason." "Order?" David barked, incredulous. "You think this is about order? My son wasn't causing trouble. He wasn't hurting anyone. He was just trying to help. And instead of giving him a warning, instead of showing a shred of decency, you throw him in jail like he's some kind of hardened criminal. What message do you think that sends to him? To the people who saw you drag him away?" Tyler, still sitting in the cell, watched as his father's words hung in the air. He had never seen his dad like this, so furious, so unyielding. And for the first time since this whole nightmare began, Tyler felt a small glimmer of hope. His dad was standing up for him. He wasn't alone. Hank shifted slightly, his eyes flicking over to Tyler for a brief moment before returning to David. "I'm just doing my job," he said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "No," David shot back. "You're hiding behind your badge, behind rules that make no sense. And you're hurting people in the process." The two men stood there, locked in a silent standoff. Hank's face remained hard, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. He had heard angry parents before, people who screamed about unfairness, about their circumstances. But something about David's words struck deeper. Maybe it was the fire in his voice, the way he spoke not just for himself but for his son, for the injustice of the whole situation. Or maybe, deep down, Hank knew that David was right. Finally, David spoke again, his voice softer but still filled with resolve. "You can take my son into that cell, you can lock him up for a few hours, maybe even fine us. But you can't take away what he did. He was trying to do something good, something right. And the fact that you can't see that, the fact that this system can't see that, that's the real crime." Hank stood there, silent, his gaze hard and unreadable. For a moment, it seemed like he might say something in response, but he remained quiet. David didn't wait for an answer. He turned to Tyler, giving his son a small nod that spoke volumes. Tyler met his father's gaze, and for the first time since this nightmare began, he felt a little less afraid. The tension in the room remained thick as Hank stood frozen, his hands still at his sides, his mind racing. For the first time in a long time, he questioned himself, not the law, not the rules, but himself. He had always prided himself on being the enforcer, the man who upheld order. But now, in the face of David's words, he couldn't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, he had made the wrong call. The silence that followed David's words lingered in the air like a thick cloud. Hank stood still, the tension between him and David palpable. It was as if the weight of everything David had said was finally sinking in, not just for Hank, but for everyone in the room. The other officers, the witnesses, everyone felt it. But Hank, more than anyone, was wrestling with an uncomfortable realization that had started to gnaw at him. Tyler, sitting behind the cold bars of the holding cell, watched the scene unfold, his heart racing. His father's defense had been fierce, passionate, and Tyler couldn't help but feel a swell of pride, even amidst the fear and confusion of the situation. His dad, broken as he was physically, still had that fire inside him, the fire that Tyler had always admired. But Tyler also understood the weight of the consequences looming over them. After what felt like an eternity, Hank finally broke the silence. He shifted his stance, his jaw tightening as if he were about to speak. But the words didn't come immediately. When they did, they were slow, measured, and not as certain as they had been before. "This isn't personal," Hank muttered, but the firmness in his voice had softened. "I have a job to do. I can't just let everyone off the hook because they have a hard story." David's eyes blazed with anger again, but this time, he held his ground, his voice calmer. "It's not about letting people off the hook. It's about seeing the difference between right and wrong. My son isn't a criminal. You know that. But if you arrest him, you'll make him feel like one." The room was heavy with the weight of David's words. Hank shifted uncomfortably. He was a man who had always prided himself on following the letter of the law. Rules were rules, and his job was to enforce them, no matter the circumstances. But now, as he stood there facing a father who had clearly fought harder battles than Hank could ever imagine, he began to question whether his rigid adherence to the rules had blinded him to something more important: compassion. Hank's mind raced as he thought back to all the times he had dealt with situations like this. He had always been the enforcer, the one who made sure the streets were in order, no matter how harsh it seemed. But what was it all for? He wasn't sure anymore. The world wasn't as black and white as he had once thought. In the background, another officer who had been watching the scene unfold cleared his throat, stepping forward slightly. "Maybe there's another way to handle this, Hank," the officer said quietly, almost as if he, too, could sense the wrongness of what was happening. Hank glanced at the officer, then back at David, whose expression remained hard but unwavering. He felt a tightening in his chest, a sensation he wasn't used to. Guilt. It gnawed at him, and for the first time in a long time, he couldn't brush it aside. "You've got a point," Hank finally admitted, his voice lower now, as if he was conceding to himself more than anyone else. Maybe this doesn't have to go down like this." David didn't move, didn't say anything, but the hard line of his mouth softened slightly. His fists, still balled at his sides, loosened just a bit. He had fought his battle, and now it was up to Hank to decide what came next. Hank turned to Tyler, who was still sitting on the cold bench, his wrists red from where the handcuffs had been too tight. The boy looked so small, so scared, and for the first time, Hank really saw him. Not as a street vendor breaking the law, but as a kid trying to survive in a world that didn't make room for kids like him. He took a deep breath, then motioned to the officer standing nearby. "Get him out of there," Hank said quietly. "Take the cuffs off." Tyler blinked in disbelief, his eyes darting between his father and Hank. Was it really over? The officer nodded and quickly stepped over to the cell, unlocking the door with a soft click. As the cuffs fell away from Tyler's wrists, he stood, rubbing his sore arms, still too stunned to speak. David exhaled slowly, his shoulders relaxing for the first time since he had walked into the station. "Thank you," he said, his voice low but filled with relief. Hank didn't respond immediately. He was still processing everything, still trying to reconcile the man he thought he was with the man he had become. Finally, he nodded, though he didn't meet David's eyes. "Just take him home," Hank said, his voice gruff. David placed a hand on Tyler's shoulder as they moved toward the door, but before they left, he turned back to Hank. "This isn't just about my son," he said, his voice steady. "It's about all the kids out there who are trying to make it, who don't have another option. Think about that next time." Hank watched as they walked out of the station, the weight of David's words hanging over him. The door closed behind them with a soft thud, and Hank stood there for a long time, staring at the empty space where they had been. As the minutes passed, Hank found himself lost in thought, reflecting on everything that had happened. He had spent years enforcing the law with an unyielding hand, believing that it was his duty to keep order at any cost. But now, standing in the aftermath of this confrontation, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had been wrong. Not just today, but for a long time. This case, this kid, had shaken something loose in him. And though Hank didn't know what he was going to do with that feeling just yet, he knew that things couldn't stay the same. Not anymore. The ride home from the police station was quiet, but the weight of the day still hung over Tyler and his father like a dark cloud. Tyler sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window as the city lights blurred past. His wrists still ached from the cuffs, a physical reminder of the ordeal he had just endured. David drove in silence, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly, his mind replaying the events of the day over and over. Neither of them spoke until they reached the small apartment where Tyler's mother, Maria, was waiting anxiously. The moment they walked through the door, Maria rushed to Tyler, pulling him into a tight hug, her eyes filled with both relief and worry. "What happened?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I was so scared, Tyler." Tyler didn't know how to begin. How could he explain the fear, the humiliation, and the helplessness he had felt in that cell? He glanced at his father, hoping he would fill in the gaps. David stepped forward, his voice steady but heavy with the weight of what had transpired. "There was an incident with the police," David said, choosing his words carefully. "Tyler got caught selling candy, and they arrested him." Maria's face went pale, her hand flying to her mouth. "They arrested him? For selling candy?" David nodded, his eyes dark with anger. "Yes, Hank Peterson, the police chief, decided to make an example out of him." Maria's eyes filled with tears as she pulled Tyler closer, her voice breaking. "Oh, baby, I'm so sorry. You shouldn't have had to go through that." Tyler, still shaken but trying to stay strong for his mother, simply nodded. "I just wanted to help," he whispered. "I know," Maria said softly, kissing the top of his head. "I know you did." They sat together in the small living room, the silence thick with unspoken emotions. Tyler's family had always been close, but this experience had brought them even closer, reminding them of how fragile their situation was, how easily things could spiral out of control. But the story didn't end there. The next morning, news of Tyler's arrest began to spread through the neighborhood. People who had seen the arrest unfold, who had stood by as Tyler was taken away in handcuffs, started talking. Whispers of injustice filled the air, and soon, those whispers became louder, fueled by a sense of outrage over how a child could be treated like a criminal for something so small. The story reached local news outlets, and soon enough, it was being discussed on television and social media. Tyler's arrest became a flashpoint for a larger conversation about the treatment of street vendors, the harsh enforcement of minor infractions, and the lack of empathy in the legal system. People began to question the priorities of a city where a child could be jailed for trying to help his struggling family, while larger, more serious issues seemed to go unchecked. Hank Peterson, once the unyielding enforcer of the law, found himself at the center of a growing controversy. The pressure mounted as more people demanded answers, calling into question the city's policies on street vending and its treatment of low-income families. Hank, who had always prided himself on being a man of order, now faced a public reckoning. But the most surprising part of it all was how the community rallied behind Tyler and his family. Neighbors, local businesses, and even strangers who had heard about the story began to reach out, offering support. Some donated money to help the Johnsons with their rent and bills, while others advocated for changes in the city's laws, pushing for more compassionate policies that wouldn't criminalize children like Tyler for trying to make ends meet. For Tyler, the outpouring of support was overwhelming. He had never expected any of this. In the days following his arrest, he struggled to process everything that had happened. But he also felt something else, a sense of hope, a feeling that maybe things could change, not just for him, but for other kids like him who were trying to survive in a world that often felt unfair. And as for Hank, the incident forced him to reflect on his own role in the system he had spent years upholding. He couldn't ignore the public outcry, nor could he ignore the nagging voice in the back of his mind that had started the day David Johnson confronted him at the station. Over the next few weeks, Hank found himself questioning the rigid enforcement of laws that didn't always make sense in the real world. Laws that disproportionately affected the most vulnerable. In time, Hank took a step back from his duties, handing over day-to-day operations to his deputy while he took some much-needed time to reassess his approach to law enforcement. He began to engage with community leaders, listening to the concerns of those who had long felt overlooked and mistreated by the system. It wasn't an easy process, and it didn't happen overnight, but Hank started to change. Meanwhile, the city council took note of the public reaction to Tyler's arrest, and discussions about reforming the city's policies on street vending began. New laws were proposed, ones that would allow young vendors like Tyler to sell their goods legally, without fear of punishment. It was a small victory, but for the Johnson family and their community, it felt like a step in the right direction. As for Tyler, life slowly returned to normal. He went back to school, trying to move past the trauma of his arrest. But the experience had changed him in ways he hadn't expected. He had seen the harsh realities of the world up close, but he had also seen the power of people coming together to stand up for what was right. It gave him a new sense of purpose, a belief that even in the face of injustice, change was possible. And though he would never forget what happened, Tyler knew that he wasn't alone. His family, his community, and even people he had never met were with him, supporting him as he moved forward. In the end, that was what mattered most. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and watch this next story. It's incredibly emotional.